That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about Respect, the highly anticipated biopic of Aretha Franklin starring Jennifer Hudson. It's the directorial debut of Liesl Tommy, and MGM and United Artists Releasing has it slated to open August 13th, 2021.
Nick keeps a spreadsheet of all of the movies he watches, and this film has the distinction of being your 10,000th entry.
Yeah.
So there's that. Where to begin?
Since 2008.
So in, 13 years? We've
bad.
watched 10,000 movies.
That's not that bad. Right? Anyhow.
People should comment below what they think about that. It's impressive. I can say that. This film, not so much, though.
You're so sweet. Yeah, I was not impressed by this film. Maybe we had high hopes.
So, why don't we talk about our relationship to Aretha Franklin?
Oh, God. Okay.
Do you want to start?
I mean, my
what's your relationship to her music?
Well, I like her music. My mother had cassette tapes of several Aretha albums, and I remember listening to Respect as a kid. I probably have more vivid memories. My dad really liked the Blues Brothers, so I remember watching that a lot, which she appears in as a supporting character. And then, of course, throughout the 80s and 90s and the Got to Be Real series, where she's kind of caricaturized along with a lot of other black women. Is probably more prominent in my mind, but yeah.
Yeah, I didn't grow up listening to Aretha. I preferred Patti, Gladys, Chaka Khan. If we're talking about women from that era.
Sure.
Aretha was probably lowest on my list.
I don't know that I thought of her in those terms. It's just that I distinctly recall listening to her music as a kid.
That being said, I have an ex who is obsessed with her, and within the first month of us dating, and this is right when iPods came out, he gave me an iPod filled with her entire catalog. So, retroactively, I became very familiar with her music. A lot of it I do enjoy. Relative to her catalog, it's probably a small percentage, but there are a number of Aretha songs I really, really like.
Freeway of Love?
So my tops are Freeway of Love,
yeah.
Chain of Fools, Ain't No Way, and Old Landmark from the Amazing Grace album, which is not featured in this film. But she does do Ain't No Way and Chain of Fools, so that's nice.
Respect is not in your top?
No.
Really?
It's a great song, but it's not my favorite of hers. And I've had the opportunity to see her in concert twice. So she is undoubtedly the Queen of Soul. And, people use icon and legend a lot, but she is the definition of a musical icon and legend. I don't think this film did her justice, and it's really hard to tackle a figure, a historical figure of that magnitude. I think the first example that pops into my head is Ava DuVernay's Selma.
Yeah. Which
the impact Martin Luther King Jr. had on the culture is so enormous that I think it really required that we sort of pinpoint a moment.
Yeah. And this film covers 20 years of her life as a 10-year-old, 30-year-old, roughly from 1952 to 72.
It's told sort of in chronological order.
But it is in the script by Tracey Scott Wilson, who also has worked primarily in television, like the director, and Callie Curry, who has an Academy Award for Thelma and Louise, has a story credit, is very attenuated to the cliched parameters of a very safe PG-13 biopic.
Okay, the story is pretty easy to tell. So the first, the movie's 2 hours, 20 minutes. The first 20 minutes, we get little Aretha, right?
Jennifer shows up in about 25, 26 minutes.
So 25 minutes of Aretha at 10. So we're introduced to her. Her dad, played by Forrest Whitaker, who plays her father, who is Reverend C.L. Franklin, who was a well-known minister. He wakes her up and says, "Hey, my guests downstairs want to hear you sing." She goes downstairs and sings, and that's when we're introduced to the idea that her father was a very notable preacher. Like Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Dinah Washington, like they were all like friends of his who would visit the house. Mm-hmm. So we see those people at the party. Little Aretha sings. We also understand that her mother, who's played by Audra McDonald. Audra McDonald. Aretha's mom and dad are separated, and their relationship is strenuous or tenuous. What's the word?
Either of those works, I think.
Yeah, they don't get along.
Strained, yeah.
When all of a sudden Aretha's mom dies at the age of, you looked it up, 34.
Well, I had to look it up because it's such a blip in the film that I wanted how did she die?
We're also in that first part introduced to the idea that Aretha was molested as a 10-year-old. Okay, then we fast forward
to 1959.
1959, so Aretha is like an 18, 19-year-old. And she's just singing. We see that she signs with Columbia Records. She does 9 albums, no hits. Mm-hmm. She starts dating a man named Ted White, played by Marlon Wayans. Mm-hmm. And he wants to take her career in a different direction to get her some hits. She hooks up with Jerry Wexler, played by Marc Maron. Mm-hmm. And that's when she starts changing up her musical flow.
Goes to Alabama to record
with a bunch of white boys, and she starts making hits. But her relationship with Ted White is abusive. She ends up leaving him and marrying her tour manager,
Ken, played by Albert Jones.
And they seem happier, but that's when we're introduced to her demons, which are alluded to throughout the film, but we really tackle it towards the last quarter of the film. And that's all. So it's just Aretha sort of in the late 60s, early 70s making hits. A lot of little things happen. There, a pretty big portion of the film is allotted to her work in the civil rights movement and her relationship to Martin Luther King Jr. Mm-hmm. But the end of the film is her trying to break free from her alcoholism, which pops up all of a sudden.
Yeah.
All of a sudden she's a raging alcoholic. We really don't even see her drink, and then all of a sudden she's a booze hound, and her life's out of control. She decides she needs to go back to the church, and she wants to record what is now her infamous best-selling album, Amazing Grace, and she thinks that will sort of get her back on track. Mm-hmm. So we see her in preparation for that very shortly. It's very quick. She sings Amazing Grace, the end.
And then about 6 title credits to explain what happened.
And then we'll get into that.
Sure.
Yeah. And then the end credits, we see the actual Aretha Franklin performing Natural Woman at the Kennedy Center Honors, honoring Carole King, who wrote Natural Woman. Yeah. There was a Q&A.
A live
Q&A because we saw it a pre-screen, we paid, but it was a pre-thing. But we didn't stay for that. Yeah, so...
Let's talk about what we liked.
Well, so this is definitely elevated from your standard TV movie biopic for sure, and I think a big part of that is they have the music
that Jennifer Hudson is singing to.
So they have the hits, and then Jennifer Hudson's voice is obviously top notch, stellar, AAA. So the best parts of the film are when Jennifer's singing, which is a lot. Mm-hmm. I think the best scenes of the film is when Jennifer is quite a bit of time is spent on Aretha and how because Aretha wasn't known as she didn't write her own music, and her biggest hits are not songs that she wrote or even original songs by her, but her musical arrangements are what they really highlight here. So there are 3 scenes in particular where she's arranging music. The first time with that white band in Alabama, I thought that scene was great. Mm-hmm. Then when she comes up with the arrangement for the song Respect with her 2 sisters singing background, and then Ain't No Way that her sister wrote, that scene's really powerful because the recording is being filmed by a reporter, and it's like she's singing it to her husband, played by Marlon Wayans, who's visibly upset by it. So anytime Jennifer's singing, or the musicality of it, I think that those are highlights. Other highlights are Audra McDonald.
Audra McDonald and Mary J. Blige.
Who are both underutilized.
As Dinah Washington, who I both wanted more of. But yeah, Audra McDonald especially has, kind of that Felicia Rashad, Sheryl Lee Ralph energy that's just, you gravitate towards her. And then the wardrobe, I would say kudos to that as well, because I thought Jennifer Hudson looked, there's a large amount of costume changes that all of which I thought looked impressive.
There are. I'm just gonna go through my notes.
I do think this felt like a well-produced television film, how it's laid out as a biopic, though.
After Aretha's mother dies, Aretha goes silent for some time, like several weeks.
Selective mutism, what they call it now.
And then she finally sort of breaks out of that by singing in the church again. Mm-hmm. I think. So what doesn't work for me? There is some so Aretha Franklin as a celebrity is known for being very sort of uptight and reserved, very not very forthcoming. I would say private.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I didn't know what to expect. So the revelations that she was molested. Because she had her kids when she was her first kid when she was 11, I think.
Well, so yeah, when they do the transition to 1959, it's Jennifer Hudson. She goes back home and she's got 2 boys, and it's like only 7 years passed and you got 2 boys. Are we gonna talk about that?
Yeah, we don't talk about that.
It's offhand in another really good scene actually is with Mary J. Blige as Dinah Washington having that scene in the club where she said, "Are you ever gonna tell us who the father is?" But strangely, maybe because of the estate's authorization didn't want us to go into that, and not that we really need to exploit her trauma, but there are these large spaces where it's like, well, wait, she had 2 babies as a young girl.
Because we see her pregnant at 11.
Yeah, they show a shot.
Which is jarring to see a young girl with a belly.
And nobody knows who the father is, at least presented here, but he was allowed to creep in the house somehow. And not after she had 1 kid as an 11-year-old, she had another one. I needed to understand.
Someone has some splaining to do. How did this little 11-year-old girl get pregnant, and then she gets pregnant again after that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, and again, more often than not, that has marked a lot of young women's lives. But immediately it made me think of, I know why the Cage Bird sings, because Maya Angelou was raped as a very young girl by a relative. But when I read that as a kid, that had a profound effect on me. And this doesn't, it's just like, oh yeah, this happened. But it's like, no, we need to.
It caught me off guard that they,
that.
that it's just a blip. And I didn't have a chance to sort of catch my breath. Wait. Because like you said, when we see Aretha go back at the age of 17 or 18, and then we see these 2 bigger kids run up to her hey mom, I was in shock. And she said I didn't realize she was such a young mother. And then later when we see her pregnant as a child, I mean, it's shocking to not address.
And then she has one comment about it every time I come back they want to see me less. And then throughout the film, she has another kid with Ted White and kind of deposits that kid with her grandmother, C.L. Franklin's mother, who's just taking care of generations worth of kids in this family. And we don't. It's easier to kind of give us the standard battered woman who overcomes narrative rather than the kind of the discomfort that rests in that kind of abuse and how we don't want to deal with it.
Yeah, so that combined with the physical abuse she experienced at the hands of Ted White.
And even her dad, kind of.
And then her dad, who seems like such an asshole. And it is depicted by Forest Whitaker again, who I think does a fine enough job, because her actual dad, if you look up pictures of him, I mean, he just looks like a creep. But, I feel like those things don't really seem to show how they had an effect on her, except that she is not very forthcoming. It seems like she doesn't want to stand up for herself. There are many scenes where things are happening around her and she just doesn't want to speak up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like she's a passive participant. They even have a shot of the handshake with Tate Donovan and her father right in front of her face.
Yes.
Like, yeah.
But I think, okay, so with films like this, I always think, okay, if a person didn't know, it's how I felt about the Mary J. Blige documentary on Amazon Prime. Like, if you didn't know Mary J. Blige's work, how would you feel about this? And who doesn't know Aretha Franklin? But if you didn't know Aretha Franklin very well, I feel like this depiction of her in this 20-year period doesn't really explain like who she ended up becoming. Because the Aretha Franklin, I think we all know, is like this very strong woman who accomplished so much. But watching the film is like, all you get the sense of is she's a sort of a feeble, quiet woman with this voice from the heavens.
Mm-hmm. So Amazing Grace, the album, was released, the recording of it, but a documentary was shot simultaneously, and that is presented here as an idea of her managers basically saying, or Jerry Wexler saying that, kind of for the white audience to get on board with wanting to buy a gospel album. So Sidney Pollack actually directed that, and that documentary wasn't released until a couple years ago for the very first time that anybody actually saw that. And we watched that, and I remember thinking, this woman looks so unhappy here. Like, she looks so kind of pent up. Like, there's something very reserved, something very melancholy about her. And then come to find, she really was wrestling a lot of personal demons. And I don't know if the film leaving us off in this particular moment is like, oh, she's succeeded, personally at least. And so that's interesting to me.
We see her in 1970 move to Los Angeles to this big, beautiful modern house back then, which I think I've heard Janet Jackson tell stories of how she used to live across the street from Aretha when Aretha lived in LA, and that she would play with her kids.
Okay.
So when I saw that house, it made me think of that. But anyway, there's a scene where they're in the house and Aretha is on one because she finds out that like her tour manager or her business manager has like canceled dates. That's another thing. They're saying that her behavior's erratic and she's missing like concert dates and she's going to be sued. But we don't see any of that. We don't see her out of control. They're just telling us. And then she goes off. Like, I need to work because if I don't work, y'all don't eat. And y'all just want to eat off me. And like, no, put my tour dates back on. Like, she has this like moment that's very like, what's love got to do with it? But there's a really cool shot in that scene where she's standing underneath a portrait of herself. And she is angry. And I thought, that moment in that scene, I feel like the film needed a little bit more of that. Like, I wanted to see the power of the Queen of Soul, not this like quiet woman who doesn't speak up for herself for 2.5 hours.
Because the problem with Jennifer Hudson's performance in this is, yes, she comes to life, and yes, the songs are sung powerfully, beautifully even, but when she is trying to mimic or personify Aretha's particular way of speaking and moving even as a younger woman comes off as camp.
And inconsistent.
But there are scenes where she has to say more than a few sentences at the same time. She's trying to do that. You can see her trying to do the speech pattern thing, and it is It's like accent work that is subpar.
I agree. In that same vein, Marlon Wayans is... I think he's a fine actor, but he's trying to do this voice that's almost like... It reminded me of on the Wayans Brothers when Marlon's character would try to act professional. Like, he's wearing a suit and he's talking like this. It read like that, so that was distracting. And then Tituss Burgess plays like an old...
Reverend Dr. James Cleveland.
Who, if you've listened to the Amazing Grace album, he's the one talking on it. And she had worked with him as a child as like the choir director in her dad's church. But he also has like a speech impediment. And I couldn't stop thinking of the movie Kingdom Come and the...
Cedric the Entertainer.
The preacher man that Cedric the Entertainer played. So I thought that was distracting. My notes were really just sort of like highlighting things that happened throughout the movie, but nothing really...
I think doing a biopic is very difficult because you're trying to satisfy so many things and mention... Like, she has such an impressive career and legacy...
And catalog.
Catalog that it's impossible. But what I think would have worked really well is something a little more... like spiritually consistent with this woman is, I think Jennifer Hudson is great for the singing parts, but when we're trying to depict her as this diminished person that's kind of, you know, thrown around like tossed around like a pinball between these men controlling her, I think it should have been played by a different actress, like a different woman.
I think something much more interesting something like that. Or I was even thinking immediately when it ended, like, maybe we should have just focused on the recording of the Amazing Grace album and where she was in her life.
And get some flashbacks.
Get flashbacks, but really understand that was like, because the way this film posits it is that was like a turning point in her life. Like that's, I guess, where she got her strength. But we don't see it.
We don't see it.
And then if you don't know her, it's like we don't know how it ended up.
And then I think flashbacks can be used for ambiguity purposes as well, because, you know, we don't need to see a 10-year-old get raped, but at least be made to understand how these feelings were at least worked through or patched over enough for this family to kind of move on from there.
And we really don't see any relationship with her children, so it's almost like, do we even need to know about her children? Because the most we see about her kids is that the grandma takes care of them.
Basically.
Like we just see her dropping them off, picking them up.
But Mary J. Blige does look really good in that scene as Dinah, where she throws over the
There's
table.
a scene where Aretha's performing in a nightclub and she introduces the audience like, oh, we have Dinah Washington here, close friend of the family. In honor of her, I'd like to do a song. And Aretha starts singing a Dinah Washington song. And you can see Dinah getting agitated, looking fabulous. And Dinah like jumps up from her seat, flips the table Teresa Giudice style, and says, bitch, if you're gonna sing, like, you can't sing the Queen song in front of her. And then like drags her back into the dressing room. And then they have sort of an honest conversation about like, the reason you don't have any hits is because you're not singing music that connects with you.
Yeah.
I thought that was a good scene.
But the fur she's wearing, that is...
She looks great.
She looks pretty good. And I wanted more of...
This video's long.
How Aretha kind of, you know, is known for throwing some people under the bus in the way she does. Because they have that...
Yes.
There's a line about Mahalia Jackson.
Oh, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, she said something like, Mahalia didn't pay me. She said I get paid when I go to heaven or something.
That's right. Yeah, I wanted to... Well, that's what I said earlier. Like, I just wanted to see some of the power and the sass that we associate with the Queen of Soul. And Jennifer Hudson in that portrayal is just not giving that. And again, if you're not super familiar with Aretha Franklin, you would leave this film thinking that she's like this broken, meek woman.
We get like several scenes with MLK.
Which I feel is like one of those things like, you know, if Aretha had input in the screenplay, I feel like she's like, y'all better make sure you let everyone know I knew MLK. Because he takes up quite a bit of the film. And
that's another scene that bothered me. They show a scene with him presenting a proclamation to her, and then she's like, well, what else is there to say but this? And then strives over to a piano and starts belting out Natural Woman. It's like, wait, when did you record Natural Woman?
Yeah, it's just like the big markers in her career seem glossed over. The film doesn't make Aretha seem as grand as she was in those periods. Like when we see her perform Respect at Madison Square Garden, it's okay. I mean, I don't know. It just didn't feel up to the level of like this prolific, like iconic entertainer.
Again, I think it's very difficult to do a biopic and stay faithful to lots of things and to where the money's from and who has control. I've seen a lot worse, but again, you know, I think I was expecting a lot more.
I'd like to be done. What would you give it?
2.5.
I would give it 2.5 out of 5 as well. Thank you.
Bye.